lives in the UK. Her father was a court jeweller, silversmith, goldsmith, and you're going to talk to us about
him as well as yes.
Well as the Armenians.
So, yes.
So I'll leave you to say anything more about yourself. I think is the safest and sensible thing.
All right. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming on this stormy day. And as Anne said, after such a sad happening in Ethiopia with the Ethiopian Airlines crash. But life goes on, and the lecture will go on. I'm so sorry that happened. Anyway, thank you very much for coming to hear me talk. And thank you, the Anglo-Ethiopian Society, for inviting me and hosting this event. This talk acknowledges the kindness and hospitality shown by Ethiopians to Armenians. It majors on a time of enormous progress achieved in the 19th and 20th centuries by the Ethiopian people through the vision of two great men, Menelik II and Haile Selassie I, emperors of Ethiopia. After centuries of near total oppression because of their religion and their race, Armenians were happy to have found a place where they could freely practice their religion and where they could thrive. It is often assumed that there were thousands of Armenians in Ethiopia. I once heard 10,000. I've even heard 15,000. But in reality, there were never more than 1,200 at their height in the 1930s. The reason people assume there were so many is because it was a successful community, which integrated very well, and very few who did not do well. And that is why Ethio-Armenians have such a nostalgic and great feeling towards Ethiopia, and they feel very tied to it. The two emperors and their people have to be thanked at the outset of this talk for providing shelter and opportunity to a people who are in great need, having escaped massacres and ultimately genocide in their homelands in the Ottoman Empire. Armenians were able to settle and draw breath and enjoy using their many talents in the service of their new emperors. Armenians have been mentioned in the same breath as Ethiopians since very ancient times. Beside their religious association, there has been a long history of trade, diplomacy, and art. So I will start with some of these associations. I have drawn a timeline which you may find useful. So it's over 3 pages, so anyway. Armenia was the first state to adopt Christianity as its religion. Ethiopia was the second. Ever since then, there has been communion between our two churches. After the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the discussions of which are well beyond my scope, Armenia did not attend this council as she was at war with Persia. Armenians, Ethiopians, and the Egyptian Copts drew together because they did not agree with the rest who had attended the council. And the Armenian church and the Ethiopian church became sister churches. After the Hamidian massacres of 1895 and 96 and the Armenian genocide of 1915, Armenians chose to settle in Ethiopia because of their religion, principally. The two nations have much in common. In Jerusalem, in particular, for example, the fountain of where Philip baptized the Ethiopian treasurer belongs to the Armenian Patriarchate. We share a favorite female saint, Surperipsime of the Armenians, known as Qudist Arsema to the Ethiopians, after whom at least 3 churches are named in Ethiopia, including the one on an island in Lake Tana, which has a reputation for many, many miracles. It is said that in the 7th century, when the Arabs invaded Armenia, Armenians headed south, some eventually finding themselves in northern Ethiopia to settle on an island in Lake Haik, in Wollo. Haik is the ancient Armenian name for Armenia. There is near the lake today a town called Armenia. Here is an illumination in a Bible from Haik, which shows a priest wearing an Armenian hood, pointy rather than round, with a long sort of scarf thing at the back. One of the questions I am often asked is whether the Armenian and Ethiopian alphabets are related, and which came first. At first glance, they are quite similar, but a closer look will show they are quite distinct. We can safely say that Giz precedes the Armenian by hundreds of years. Probably, as clerics and priests used to mingle in Jerusalem, Mesrop Mashtots, the monk who invented the Armenian alphabet, in 405, is likely to have seen Giz and been influenced by it. Not the sounds, perhaps, but the shapes of the characters. Here are 2 pictures I would like to show you of the same canon tables to compare alphabets and art. The first one is a page from the Garima Gospels, from Garima in Tigray, which has some remarkably Armenian-looking illuminations and writing. The colors, the illustrations of the birds, the tolos. The other is a page of Toros Roslin's illuminations of about 1260. Abba Garima preceded Toros Roslin by some 700 years, and yet the similarities in the two are remarkable, I think. And then we have the concept of Tzita in Amharic and Garod in Armenian. Its equivalent is Garod in Armenian. The 2 words convey a nostalgia and longing, which are very similar in the 2 cultures. These words have no real equivalent in English. It is a nostalgia and longing tinged with almost painful, irredeemable sadness and loss. And this we share. There are few detailed mentions of Armenians in English histories, Armenians of Ethiopia, but an important one is that of Matteos Armenawi, Matthew the Armenian. In the 17th century, we don't know how he happened to be there, but during the Arab invasions of Ethiopia, King Fasilidas asked him to go abroad and seek the help of a Christian king to oust the Muslims. The Portuguese eventually agreed to help and did so. Matthew died in Portugal in the meantime. But at the same time, of course, the Portuguese brought all their Jesuit priests and tried to impose Catholicism on Ethiopia. They were expelled, and King Fasilidas thereafter closed the country to all white people, except Greeks and Armenians, because they were Orthodox. In European travel books at the time, it was recommended that one dress as an Armenian when traveling to Ethiopia. But the Ethiopians got wise to this, and all those who turned up were subjected to detailed cross-examination in Armenian religious tradition. And of course, only Armenians knew about that. Another Armenian we know of is Hodja Murad from Aleppo, who arrived in Ethiopia about 1646. And within a decade, he was handling most of the king's export-import trade. He represented 3 Ethiopian kings in various European capitals, and most importantly, in the dealings with the East India Company. So, and another Armenian was Timotheos Sarkissian from Jerusalem, who traveled to Egypt and Ethiopia in the 1890s, recording what he saw as he went along. His works were translated into Italian, French, and English, and used as a crucial travel guide. The modern community, however, could be said to have started to establish itself when in the 1870s, Boros Markarian arrived from Sebastia to supply goods and arms to the cause of Emperor Johannes IV and later Emperor Menelik II, with whom he formed a great friendship. Sarkissian from Arabkir, who claimed to have walked from the port of Zeyla, which is in northwest Somalia, to Ankober, about 820 kilometers, arrived soon after. In 1890, he became a major arms dealer, an arms buyer, I should say, for Menelik II, supplying 80,000 rifles and 3 million rounds of ammunition, which were to defeat the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. And here we have a picture of Sarkissian and his lovely wife, and all the modern armaments they could supply. And the interesting thing is, this is a brochure of their business, and it's got Amharic, it's got Armenian, and it's got French. And I suppose this must be soon after they were married. Sarkissian is known as Tlik Sarkis, Great Sarkis, on account of his having brought all those armaments, secretly and at great risk to himself, from Belgium and France. The Italians, who were expecting a poorly equipped army, were surprised by a well-armed force who roundly defeated them. Later, when Addis Ababa was being built, Sarkis brought steam engines for road building, sawmills, flour mills, and the like. The steamroller for the roadworks was put to much use, and eventually it broke down. As it was too heavy to remove, it was left in situ for many years, giving the district in which it remained the name Sabara Babur. Have you heard that? Broken Babur, with Babur being the word in Amharic that had been coined from the Italian vapore. Immigration of Armenians to Ethiopia increased towards the end of the 19th century under Menelik II, who welcomed them. Having unified the country, Menelik had moved his capital from Ankober to Addis Ababa, opening up Ethiopia from a hitherto closed society to outside trade and modernization. And crucially, this was because it was without submitting to a colonial power. At his coronation in 1889, Menelik had pointedly refused the gift of a crown by the Italian government, from the Italian government, preferring instead the crown made for him by Dikran Ebeyan, an Armenian jeweler brought from Constantinople by his friend Markarian. Ebeyan had also made the crown for Johannes IV in 1881. Ebeyan was thus the precursor of a long line of Armenian jewelers in Ethiopia, the last of whom, the Parsechian sisters, still work in Addis, in Piazza. And here we have the famous crown. In 1900, more Armenians came, including architect Krikor Haljan, who started to give shape to the streets of Addis Ababa. On his death, Minas Kherbekian, known as Muse Minas, took over the job. He was responsible for the building of Ras Makonnen Bridge, which still stands today, as you all know, as well as many of the great mansions of nobles and notables in Addis Ababa. In a very Armenian manner, they had stone core with mud outer walls over several floors, and with verandas which went all the way around, providing access to the principal rooms. Sadly, almost all of those houses have been pulled down, some very, very recently. And it is possible that Hodja and Kherbekian were the architects for Enkulalbet, which stands, I believe, still in the old Gubbi, in the grounds of the old Gubbi. And this is the picture of the Yazidjan house, which was actually destroyed soon after 1936, the 1936 riots, when it was set on fire and destroyed. Today, it's the ground on which the Moswald shops stand, if you know where that is. And this is a very famous house, and this is Muse Minas's house, which is one of the few still standing, albeit in quite a bad state. I do remember visiting it when I was a child, but I think it must be pretty rickety now. Anyway, Armenians held key government positions as public servants for Emperor Menelik, without being a colonial threat. This was their thing, was that they weren't a colonial threat in any way. However, it was business that gave Armenians prominence in Ethiopia. The community prospered. Armenian merchants were known to be shrewd, frugal, opportunity and risk-taking entrepreneurs. Some of the most important businesses dominated by Armenians were tanneries, shoe factories, printing, jewelry, car dealerships, coffee exports, tailors, flour mills, agriculture, and construction. Most shops and businesses were situated on piazza. Now, those who had settled before the 1920s and those arriving after 1945 were mostly well-educated, that is to say, other than businessmen. There were doctors and dentists, chemists, architects, engineers, lawyers, accountants, and teachers. Many of those who arrived in the 1920s as a consequence of the Armenian genocide were artisans, deracinated from their towns and villages in Asia Minor. The main motivation for the latter immigration was self-preservation, the preservation of their families, and the preservation of their nation. So there were intermarriages, of course, and especially of the men who came before 1915. But the ones who came as a result of the genocide brought with them whatever family remained, and usually these were young females, because all the young men, well, all the men over the age of 8 had been murdered pretty much, or else the ones who survived were wandering around in the deserts of Syria. So they brought their women with them, and there were men there that they could marry. The community was well structured, self-sufficient, and led by elected representatives. And these are the gentlemen in 1947. By the end of the 1940s, there were Armenians in Addis Ababa in almost every trade, profession, and industry. They had come from a very wide area and brought with them the special expertise of their hometowns. A visit to the Armenian cemetery in Gulale, in Addis Ababa, gives an idea of the origins of the 3 major waves of Armenian immigrants. The cemetery is in 2 parts. The old cemetery contains 282 burials. The new cemetery, established in 1961 on adjacent land, contains about 267 burials. And nearly every tombstone gives the birthplace of the deceased. Incidentally, initially, the Armenian community, the only one allowed to do so, buried their dead in the cemetery of the Ethiopian Orthodox St. George's Cathedral on Menelik II Square. I don't know where the others went. And of course, the community established a church, which was Surpast Vazadzin, and a primary school, Araratian. This is in 1928 or thereabouts. The old church was grass-roofed, local-style mud house. The first pastor of the community seen here was Reverend Father Hovannes Ava Kahana Geferian, who had arrived in 1923 after spending years rescuing Armenian genocide orphans from the deserts of Syria. He served the community until his death at the age of 80 in 1957. So I must have been one of the last he baptized. There was a secret police started under Menelik II, and the chief was Levon Yazidjan, who had come from Arabkir in the 1880s. And this imposing man had many functions at court. He was advisor, photographer, businessman. As can be seen, he was decorated with the Order of the Star of Ethiopia, collar and medal as police. But Levon Yazidjan also found the time to paint the murals in the interior of the church of Ntoto Mariam. And I have 3 examples. That is God the Father, I think. No, that's not. That's Jesus and his apostles. And God the Father. And Saint Michael. Anyway, Levon Yazidjan died in 1927 and was given a great funeral. He was attended by the newly arrived band of the Arbalijoch. More about them later. And that is his picture, and you can see the people who attended it go a long way back. Levon's wife, Araksi, was a formidable woman. She established the Palace Embroidery School for Queen Zauditu and later Empress Menen. She was highly skilled in the Armenian art of gold and silver thread work. You know those kabbas with a lot of, all that sort of thing. She helped Empress Menen establish the Red Cross Society, which operated out of her home, which we saw earlier. Their son was Pailag, who had multiple functions at the municipality of Addis Ababa, and who owned a cinema. And their daughter, Anna, who was a successful developer, hotelier, and educator. They were both prominent well into the 1960s. Here I have a picture of my father, the tall one, Bedros Sevadjian, with Pailag Yazidjan at the opening of the old airport, the Lideta airport, which became known as the old airport once Bole was built. So that's the airport that was in use until the 1960s. Of course, with the opening up of Ethiopia to foreign embassies and trade, there was a great need for translators. And Armenians, traditionally with Greeks, had been the best dragomans in the Ottoman Empire. They were now able to fulfill this function at various embassies and consulates in Addis Ababa. So among them were Avedis Terzian, the son of the Sarkis of the Sarkis, at the American consulate, Suren Chakarian at the Italian consulate, Antranik Papazian at the Egyptian consulate, and perhaps most famous of all, Hovannes Sevadjian at the British consulate. And he was immortalized by Evelyn Waugh in Black Mischief as Krikor Yukunyan, whose catchphrase is, "I can arrange that damn quick." Another important Armenian was Matic Govorkov. He was a French citizen, although he was from Egypt, and he became representative of the French Republic in Ethiopia. And you can see here with all his decorations from Ethiopia. This is actually the Star of Menelik, which is very rare. And these two are Egyptian. And that is the Star of Ethiopia there. Anyway, So Govorkov had moved to Djibouti at the age of 29 to pursue a highly successful career as a merchant of tobacco and other commodities. At one time, he had the monopoly for the production of cigarettes in Ethiopia. He became very rich, of course, and expanded his business empire from Harar to Dire Dawa and Addis Ababa, where he opened an emporium called Maison Govorkov, right in the middle of Piazza. But unfortunately, during the fascist occupation from 1936 to 41, as you know, but this is 1936, because he was a French national, all his assets were confiscated by the Italians as he was as enemy property. And Govorkov died in penury in Marseille in the late 1950s. And Maison Govorkov was no more. Govorkov, though, built the Armenian Community School, and naturally it was called Govorkov School. This school, which took over from the Araratian, which we saw earlier, was situated behind the new church, St. George Armenian Apostolic Orthodox Church, which was built in 1935 and financed by a gentleman called Vihan Sarkissian. Here we have, I think, 1942, when the emperor came back from exile. And that is Hovhannes Sevadjian, who is showing the emperor up the path to the church, which would be here. And all the gawky young men, Armenian men standing there. This is my father. He would have been 20-odd years old. And Matic Govorkov, you might have heard the name, and George Jerahian, I think. And another Sevadjian there, because they were very tall. I know they're the ones. Anyway, he's being shown to the church. This is the picture of the interior of the church. And the picture was given to a friend of mine called Grace Canadian in Argentina. So this picture came from Argentina, from the Dergarabedian family. This is 1935 or 1936, within a year of the church being built. And here we have the church as it is today. And in the background there is the school, Govorkov Barjaran. And this is how the school looks today. It is a school of hotel and tourism, I believe. So no children. It used to be a primary school. So it is said that the Armenians of Ethiopia never attained such positions of power as, say, did the Armenian Khedives of Egypt or the Amiras in the Ottoman Empire. However, for such a small community, they might not have held titled positions, but they did play significant roles in the modernization of the empire. Some of the businesses started by these people in so many fields still exist and are even run from the same premises as they were originally. One of the few which retains its original name and, to my knowledge, is still privately owned by the original owners is Hagbes, which employs more than 1,000 people. Now I have a few more brief biographies. My own grandfather, Avedi Sevadjian, arrived from Aintab soon after the Hamidian massacres of 1896. By 1908, he was a well-established businessman with flourishing import and export trade, a tannery, and sawmills. By 1940, he had a successful shoe factory at Gafarsa, Asko, after which a district is now named in Addis Ababa, Avedis Sevadjian Sons and Company, which supplied boots to the armed forces and police, and was run by his son Kevork until 1974. Another son, Krikor, had a flour mill, and another, Bedros, my father, about whom I will speak later, held a warrant from the Emperor Haile Selassie I. And we had Krikorios Bogosian, who came from Bardizak near Constantinople. He was a good businessman, and he became a trusted favorite of Emperor Menelik II, who appointed him as purveyor, supplier, and dealer of merchandise to the imperial palace. He married Dakuye Charlotte Berhanu in 1902, and they had 9 children. One of their sons was Khosrow Bogosian, a hero of the resistance against Italian fascist occupation. He fought at the Battle of Mechu and spent some years as prisoner of war on the island of Asinara, which was a maximum security prison. It's off the coast of Sardinia. He later attained the rank of colonel and was a balderas and commander of the imperial stables. He had many honors and medals bestowed on him, as can be seen from his gravestone. His son, Alexander Iskender Bogosian, was an internationally renowned painter. Another son, Krikorios, Khachik, became Emperor Haile Selassie I's deputy governor of Hararge province and vice minister of agriculture. Bedros Boyajian, of whom many have heard, became imperial court photographer for Emperor Menelik II in 1906, recording and photographing court life, and later that of Emperor Haile Selassie I, whose coronation he photographed. His son Tony continued taking portraits of the nobility and of Ethiopia, actually, of the day until 1974. Then we had the Darakjan brothers. Their father, Stepan, had left Harpert, which is right in the depths of Anatolia, in 1912, and made his way to Egypt, intending to emigrate to America. In a cafe, as one does, he fell into conversation with a man called Hovhannes Asadurian, who had just returned from Ethiopia. And he said, "But you are a tanner. Why are you going to America? Go to Ethiopia, where there are opportunities. People need shoes." So Darakjan did. And later, his sons Mardiros and Krikor built a modern tannery and shoe factory in Akaki called Darakjan Mardiros. And here we have the opening of the shoe factory with Krikor Darakjan there, and Algawarash, and the Crown Princess, and this lovely man, Ato Ababareta, who was the Minister of Commerce and Industry, and a great friend of my father's. The same day, with Mardiros Darakjan showing His Majesty around. The tannery and factory still exist, but they are now called Ambassa shoes. We had the Jerahian brothers from Adana, who founded Artistic Printing Press in 1930. For many years, it was the only printers in Addis Ababa with the most modern equipment. Later, there was Commercial Printing Press, which was started by the Chakarian brothers, and Central Printers, who specialized in color printing, by the Aslanian brothers. One of the most important figures, I think, of the community, the early community, is Abram Kuragin, this magnificent-looking man, who was Ras Teferi's palace directeur administratif et financier, with all that entailed. From Talas, near Kayseri, he had been to law school in Marseille, and he moved to Ethiopia in 1910. He was offered the private secretary's post by the then Ras Teferi to handle foreign correspondence. In 1920, he was one of Ras Teferi's envoys to the League of Nations in Geneva. His appointment as treasurer followed, and he established a modern customs and excise system. Following the Italian invasion, he was asked to serve in their colonial administration, which he refused. So he and his family were exiled to Calabria, along with many Ethiopian nobles, for the duration of the Italian occupation. On his return, His Majesty gave him responsibility for the administration of 30 or so monopolies, including mineral water, ambo, and tobacco. Abram Kuragin died in 1955, and he was given the honor of a state funeral. Arshavir Terzian, no relation to Sarkis, was a well-known figure in Addis Ababa. Dr. Arshavir was a philanthropist and owner of the largest privately owned medical laboratory in Addis Ababa. It still exists. It's called Arsho Labs. At his funeral in 2002, huge crowds lined the streets of Addis Ababa, leading to Surp Kevork Armenian church to bid farewell to the 80-year-old man, man of the poor, as he was called, or father of the poor sometimes. Dr. Arshavir enjoyed a personal relationship with His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie, who often called him to the palace. His Majesty trusted and valued Arshavir highly and gave him the only puppy of his beloved dog Lulu. They named the puppy Laika, since the day coincided with that of the launch of the Soviet dog cosmonaut Laika into space in 1957. Arshavir was the pharmacist and physician of the imperial family, the Ethiopian patriarch, clergy, and prominent members of the military. This same person who treated royalty had also a very large number of poor Ethiopian patients who received his care and medicines for free for over 50 years. After 1974, he continued to live in the country he loved and knew best, expanded his business, strangely enough, and continued to help the poor until the day he died. And finally, we come to the Arbali Joch. As has been told in many articles and publications, Rastafari was pleased to bring 40 orphans of the Armenian genocide to Ethiopia. On his way to Europe to address the League of Nations in 1923, he had seen the Armenian orphans at St. James's Convent in Jerusalem. The Arbali Joch, or 40 children, arrived in Addis Ababa in September 1924 on a 4-year contract to form a marching band. They were under the leadership of Kevork Nalbandian, who composed the music to the Imperial National Anthem in 1930, which was inaugurated at Haile Selassie I's coronation. Here they all are enjoying a picnic somewhere in Gafarsa, I believe. For the coronation itself, they were to play the anthems of the countries of visiting dignitaries. To their credit, they refused to play the anthem of the national anthem of Turkey, saying that they could not do so for the country which had killed all their parents and family, and they would not. It is said that after a while, His Majesty was very understanding. And one of the sons of Kevork Nalbandian was Nerses, who created Ethio jazz, which is so popular today. One of the great artists of which was Mulatu Astake. Nerses also founded the Yared School of Music and composed the Africa anthem for the Organization of African Unity. So the Arbali Joch were in their mid to late teens, though one was actually 12 years old. All were already skilled tradesmen. A great many were cobblers and watchmakers. Others were tailors, chauffeurs, and lorry drivers. They were put up in the palace grounds and given a small allowance. Most found work away from the palace too. Eventually, they were given land to build homes, Arbali Joch Sefer, which is near the stadium in Addis Ababa. However, though many did well, these 40 did not constitute the backbone of the community, as some have come to believe. By 1952, only 15 had settled in Ethiopia. A good many had left at the end of their contract, and others left when the Italians invaded. One is known to have been killed fighting in the resistance. I knew two of them personally. Sarkis Khachadurian, who was married to my Aunt Lucia, seen here with his granddaughter Elizabeth. He had survived the deportations from Van, and from the age of 7 had wandered the countryside and the deserts of Syria before being picked up and taken to an orphanage. He was a watchmaker by trade, and he died at the age of 54. His son, actually, was a fighter pilot in the Imperial Ethiopian Air Force. And that is our very lovely Captain Asefa. He was trained at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. He attained the rank of captain before retiring from the Air Force, when he joined Ethiopian Airlines and became a commercial pilot. And he piloted a plane for His Majesty several times. His main route in a Boeing 707 and 720, no 737s in those days, I suppose, was Addis Ababa to London. And Captain Asefa still lives in Addis Ababa. And the other of the Arbalijoch that I knew was Vihan Sarkissian, who was married to my father's cousin, Vartuhi Güleserian. He is seen here in the uniform of the Arbalijoch marching band. He was born in Sis, where as an 8-year-old he had witnessed the murder of his family, including that of his sister, who was thrown into a pit full of other children and set on fire and left to die. He wandered the streets of Syria before being picked up and taken to an orphanage. In the band, he played the flute. He worked as personal chauffeur to Matic Govorkov, we talked about before setting up for himself and became an importer of gabardine, which he supplied to the armed forces. He died in Addis Ababa in 1976. So following the Ethiopian Revolution of 1974, younger Armenians who had left for higher education did not return. Armenian businesses and homes were confiscated. The community was scattered all over the world. Today, the Armenian community of Ethiopia numbers about 80 people. The best known of these is Vahe Tilbian. We have some music. Vahe sings in Amharic with well-known Ethiopian musicians in Addis Ababa. He also sings in Armenian, and he sang at the 2015 Eurovision Song Contest. In recent years, he has been singing Armenian Amharic fusion songs, with recently duetting in Armenian and Amharic with the beautiful and talented Zeritu Kabbada. And you can find them online. It's really well worth listening. Most Ethiopian Armenians think of Ethiopia as their homeland and speak it with love and nostalgia. Please watch Dear Ethiopia, A Love Letter, which is a film by Asbet Pogarian. It is on Vimeo and YouTube. It is a film without words, but it encapsulates our Tizita and Garod for our country. So, anyway, so that's the first part of my talk. And if I may have a sip of water, I'll tell you the next part.